now, Mr. Spock.
Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the program. It's Chris Moore, the Moore of Pittsburgh, on the radio with you until 9 o'clock tonight. Hold your calls, as we do have a guest in this first hour. He is Owen Syme. He was Our Man in Washington is his first book, and that's why we've invited him here to talk about He Was Our Man in Washington, a history of the Obama years. Owen Syme, welcome to the program. How are you, sir?
Not too bad. Chris, about yourself?
All right. Thanks for joining us. I think that this is a fascinating history of our times and place as a nation. I mean, you look at everything from war and generals like Petraeus and others. You look at economics. You look at panics that occurred in the 1800s, what happened with the railroads. You look at economics today. You look at so many issues that probably some within our lifetime and some without need just a little bit of a reminder, if not an explanation. And I think you've done an excellent job of doing that. And every American ought to want to read this book, because it's not so much about President Obama as it is so much about our history and what a man like him might face when trying to make change.
Yeah, that's a very apt observation, Chris. That's what I tried to do with the book, was get beyond the headlines and the sound bites and really dig deep into not just Obama as a man, but as a president, as the presidency, as an institution, and how that relates to U.S. history more broadly.
In fact, you say you didn't take a great man approach to history when writing this, and I'm really glad that you didn't. And I was wondering when I was going to see the title jump forward, He Was Our Man in Washington. I thought it might be from the black community cheering him on, environmentalist or someone like that. But oddly enough, this came after a meeting that Obama had called with many of the people who caused the financial crisis of 2008, where he sort of assured them that he was the only one standing between them and the pitchforks of the American public. And it was these rich barons who came away with the phrase, He Was Our Man in Washington. Could you elaborate on that a little more?
Yeah, that's right. So one of the books I came across by a journalist named Susskind, he reported that after this meeting, which took place early in Obama's presidency, so people aren't quite sure, especially in the financial sector, what is this guy going to do? How deep is he going to lean into this public outcry for more regulation, economic justice, that kind of thing? And he has this meeting with them, and as you say, he assured them, I'm on your side. I'm the only thing between you and the pitchforks. Obviously you guys have to get yourselves under control a little bit, but I'm here to get the financial system moving again for all of our benefit. This isn't some kind of nefarious cabal necessarily. It's just kind of a reality that there's so much money in politics these days. It's difficult to get to the presidency without acquiescing to that in some degree. And so after this meeting was over, a journalist quoted one of these financial executives as, in a sigh of relief, saying, "Oh, this guy he's our man in Washington. We may not agree on everything, but he's definitely not, 100% against us."
Well, what accounted for all the right-wing hate that came against this man if some of these financial barons thought he was our man in Washington?
So I think there's two things there. First is the partisanship that's been building in this country since the 1970s, right? After the Vietnam War, the Watergate scandal, the Church Commission that unearthed all this CIA and FBI plotting on domestic soil and things like that, people have a rightful skepticism of authority, and the Republican Party took advantage of that justified skepticism and has built a political base of kind of anti-government hysteria, and to the point where a lot of Republicans now can't even really work with Democrats unless it's the military budget. For some strange reason, everyone seems to be okay with increasing the size of the Pentagon. But
include Mr. Obama.
Exactly, yeah, especially in his second term. Point being, we saw this particularly under Clinton, with the impeachment scandal and things like that. This kind of partisan rancor under Newt Gingrich and this new breed of Republicans. Even under Clinton, however, as soon as he pivoted to the right, slashing welfare funding, increasing anti-terrorism legislation, increasing police funding, signing the early 1990s crime bill, all these anti-drug legislations and things like that, he got a fair number of Republican votes, not a majority, but enough to get this through in a comfortable bipartisan basis. Deregulation of the financial industry, getting rid of the last vestiges of the New Deal. Those were things that Clinton pushed for late in his presidency, and a lot of Republicans went along with him on that. Nevertheless, partisanship remained, and I think that was augmented under Obama by a racist backlash, to put it quite frankly. Not that every Republican is consciously or unconsciously racist, but a number of the Tea Partiers, the Pat Buchanans of the world, say they were very uncomfortable with Obama as what they saw as an outsider, and the most obvious signifier of his outsider status to them was the color of his skin. So you combine this partisanship with kind of this racist backlash. The white people have been at the top of this economic and social heap that we call America for a long time. And so, a black man being elected to the highest office in the land, I think that was a wake-up call for some people with some deep-seated prejudices, and it helped them solidify this adamantine resistance that the Republicans had for anything Obama wanted to do, even if it was implement Republican ideas.
But Owen, I really think that, say for instance, if Bernie Sanders had been elected president, or AOC, or anybody on the left wing of the Democratic Party, given the history that you chronicle from war capitalism to industrial capitalism, the panics in the 1800s, what happened with the railroads, and much more, and you look at economics, and you look at Marxism, you look at neoclassical economics, you look at Keynesian economics, it seems as though no matter what laws, and you document how many laws have been passed to stop people from doing rapacious capitalism, if they are left alone, if they are left to their libertarian ideals, then it's going to run amok, and they're going to have to be regulated. And when that pendulum swings back the other way, there are other people who are going to say, we've got to unleash capitalism and let it go for itself. Mm-hmm. I don't know if Bernie Sanders or AOC would have had any more success as president than Obama did, with the exception of the color of their skin.
That's a really interesting point. It's possible that someone like Sanders might have been able to get a little bit more done domestically, but that depends, I think, a lot on how much he could have mustered his base and continued that kind of grassroots level agitation. I think it was very easy for Republicans to paint Obama as a communist outsider because of the color of his skin, because he was a community organizer in Chicago. I don't know what that is. That's a scary term. Things like that. Because he...
A lot of people in my audience, they could continue to call me and say, what's a community organizer? And I had to explain it to them, but go ahead. I'm sorry.
Yeah. Well, it's one of those things. If you're not in those organizing circles, it's a foreign concept, and what's foreign is bad, and let's keep with what's familiar. So I think you're right that's
part of the American outlook on things.
Yeah.
And that's why we're so hot on immigration, and as you have documented, have been hot on immigration for a long, long time.
Oh yeah, the first real piece of immigrant legislation that Congress passed was the Chinese Exclusion Act. It's not a coincidence it's a racist piece of legislation. Before that time, our borders were relatively open, but don't tell conservatives that because they think George Washington was on the border with a whip himself.
I just said that to someone yesterday when we were talking about this, and they were talking about Kennedy and I'm a Kennedy Democrat, and your line that he told Nixon, remind us of what he told Nixon about foreign affairs and the minimum wage.
Yeah, he said something to the effect of, pardon my French, but who gives a shit what the minimum wage is? Foreign policy is where the presidency really, really shines. That's where the glory is.
I'm sorry, I should have asked you not to use that word on the air.
Oh, that's okay. My apologies.
But basically, who gives a dump about the minimum wage? And this is President John Kennedy speaking, right?
Mm-hmm. That's correct. Yeah, he was talking to Nixon right around the time of the 1960 election. Mm-hmm.
All right, Owen Symes is our guest. We have to take a break. He was Our Man in Washington is the book, A History of the Obama Years. To me, it's not so much a history of the Obama years, but American history and what led up to any person being elected who looked like Mr. Obama and what they had to confront. We'll continue our conversation with Owen Symes in just a moment, right after these commercial announcements. Owen Symes is my guest. He was our man in Washington. It's his first book, A History of the Obama Years. As I said, this is so much more than that. It is a history of Americanism and how our country has developed and dealt with various crises over the years, and what a president like Obama would be faced when he goes into office. In fact, what I think any president with a liberal bent might be faced with. Owen, you talk about all over the book war capitalism versus industrial capitalism. How much, as a historian, as you look back at the history of our nation, when you document General Petraeus and the other generals and how many more troops they need on the war on terror, how much of that was part of war capitalism?
I think a fair bit, because at the end of the day, we're not fighting these wars out of the goodness of our hearts. We're fighting them for political control, for resources, to try and exert influence for the betterment of what at least the ruling class thinks America needs. So when we go into places like Iraq, for instance, well, we're not going there because we don't like Saddam Hussein. We're going there because there's oil there. And although America in particular doesn't benefit directly from Iraqi oil, like we're not pumping it into our cars, it is incredibly important for American-based corporations to pump out that oil, to contract with a friendly Iraqi government and send that oil to places like Western Europe. So I think that's largely where a lot of our kind of effort and focus has been the last 20 years, is shoring up where these resources are coming from and how stable that system is. Terrorism is a problem for the American government, like radical Muslim terrorism in particular, because it upsets that status quo. Any great power needs access to resources. Right now, oil is our number one resource, and the place where a lot of the oil in the world is the place with a lot of radical Muslim terrorism. So that's why I think we're fighting that more than anything else. It's upsetting the cart, so to speak.
You write that President Obama, I think after he was president, went to Rice University to speak to people down in oil country in Texas, and he reminded people about the increase in oil production under his regime. People don't think that is the case, do they? Because of right-wing media and how they pilloried him?
Oh, certainly. People like Rush Limbaugh made bank, painting him as a socialist and some kind of environmentalist wacko, when in fact, although his green power initiatives were far more laudable than anything the Bush administration tried to do, he still presided over a drastic increase in fossil fuel productions in North America and the United States in particular. One of the reasons he tried to do that was energy security. Although we've been fighting so long to try and make sure that the oil pipelines in Iraq and elsewhere are stable, intelligent people realize that's a volatile part of the world. We have fossil fuel reserves here of various sorts. Let's try and increase production of that while we still can. And his administration worked very hard for, tar sands importing and for, quote unquote, clean burning natural gas, things like that. Offshore drilling increased while he was president. And some of this was touted as environmentally friendly, natural gas, for instance, although studies indicate it's probably not, because it's not just about carbon dioxide or carbon monoxide and all that. There's other gases out there, sulfur dioxide, for instance, that these processes often produce that are incredibly harmful to the climate and everything. So his national security priorities pushed up against his climate change priorities. And, the American government being what it is, national security is always going to win out, at least in the short term. And
you mentioned the man with the golden mic, who you quote often talking about climate change as a hoax, and a lot of people believed it. I wonder where they stand now with all that we are suffering with floods, storms, wildfires, rising temperatures, and the rest.
Yeah, I think so, with controversies like that, especially for people who are not themselves professional climatologists, who might not be that well educated on these legitimately complex topics, it's good to look, people often say follow the money, and to a degree that's true. When you look at how much money is being spent on the climate change debate, what I found at least is that 10 times more money was being spent to disprove it than to get the message out that it's an actual problem. Conservative billionaires often connected to the fossil fuel industry pump billions of dollars a year into these quote-unquote think tanks to get these skepticism out there. But more importantly, I think we have to look at, okay, so this is what the vast majority of climate scientists say is causing global warming and everything else, right? It's man-made. It has a lot to do with industrialization and pumping the CO2 into the atmosphere and everything else. Is there a countervailing theory, right? When Galileo was poking around in the 16th century and he was talking about how the Earth is not the center of the universe, he had his own theory, right, that we orbited the sun. At the time, there was a countervailing theory, right, this idea that the Earth is what the sun orbits. And then there was...
He paid for it dearly, too, didn't he?
Yeah. His propaganda machine was more effective than history actually indicates. He did have house arrest. It was not comfortable, but he wasn't himself burned at the stake. But my point is, there were these two competing scientific theories that for a period of 50 to 100 years, the evidence was not clear on. People who thought that the Earth was the center of the universe, they still had some things to say up until about 1700 or so when additional evidence came out, against it. But there were two fully formed, consistent theories. With climate change, you have a fully formed and consistent theory that says climate change is real, it's man-made, and on the other side, you have doubt, and that's it. There's no countervailing theory. People will say, well, it's the sun, or it's natural, the seasons changing, or it's not even real. But all these different counter theories are mutually exclusive. If climate change isn't real, then how can the sun be causing it? And conservatives never actually latched on to a countervailing theory that could then be tested against the dominant climate change theory among scientists. And I think that says a lot about the validity of that skepticism. It's the same thing with vaccine denialism. There's not really a countervailing theory about what the vaccine is supposed to do to you. There's just a whole lot of conspiracy nonsense out there swirling about in an incoherent way, and people latch on to bits of it because they have, doubt about these things.
Boy, you're going to get in trouble with that last statement. Let's talk about one of Mr. Obama's signature achievements, or what he might have thought it was, and that was health care, and the kind of pressure that was brought against him from insurance companies to so-called nonprofit hospitals. You talk about Jeffrey Romoff and $6 million that he was making right here in Pittsburgh, and other hospitals, and how these hospitals bought up hospitals and closed them down, and access to care shrunk. What was the difficulty in getting some semblance of legislation passed there?
One of the things that I think we all agree on, at least for the most part, is that there's money in politics is a problem. And one of the problems that produces is lobbyists have a lot of say over the kind of legislation that gets crafted and debated and ultimately passed. And one of the things that Obama found when he was trying to pass healthcare reform was that there were these very powerful corporate lobbies, hospitals, pharmaceuticals, drug manufacturers, those are the big three, that had vested interests in how healthcare was provided, and then insurance companies obviously coming in with how healthcare is accessed. So unless you have some kind of countervailing political force, let's say this vast groundswell of support that is consistently organized and applied, you're going to have to play ball with those lobbying groups. There's no alternative there. And so that's the compromise that Obama ultimately had to come to in order to get at least the majority of these groups on his side to some degree or another.
And it was a difficult, if not Herculean task, was it? That kind of lobbying, the kind of money that they invest, how it influences the people who are supposed to be our representatives in the Congress. And it's not just healthcare, it's the oil lobby, it's almost every lobby, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's, I think, one of the trends that we've seen since the 1970s is this kind of coalescing of various industries into larger and larger conglomerates. You have subsidiaries on top of subsidiaries on top of, holding companies and things like that. And so you get fewer and fewer banks that are larger and larger. You get fewer and fewer gun manufacturers that are larger and larger. And this obviously has some benefits as far as economies of scale and efficiency, maybe. But one of the downsides is that when you accrue that kind of economic power, you also invariably accrue political power. And one, it's one of the...
Let me stop you right there because we have to take this next break on time. Take it right now. Owen Symes is our guest. He was our man in Washington. We'll be back in a moment. As I said, if you're just joining us, he was our man in Washington does not refer to what black people or environmentalists might have said about him, but what people in the financial industry that caused the big upset of 2008 and recession were the ones who embraced President Obama. The history lesson that you give when it comes to economics, you talk about how libertarianism was burned up. The whole idea that I guess the government needs to keep its hands off of business and let the business climate determine what should laissez-faire, what should happen, really has not worked well at all. It seems as though every time there has been a portion of American history that looked at whether it was the railroads or banking scandals or anything that there needed to be the hand of government that stepped in. And this has happened throughout time, from FDR back in the panics of 1837, 1857, and much more. Could you outline some of what your research developed and uncovered that every American ought to know about, I think, but does not?
I think what we need to start with is the fact that until the 1970s, it was generally the consensus that government had some legitimate role in the economy. It's a fact of reality that when people are left to themselves, they often will abuse their authority, even if it's accidental at first. Not that everyone is rapacious or a scallywag, but you gotta keep people accountable. And the argument that libertarians started to make in the 70s was that businesses will keep themselves accountable via the competition mechanism of the market. If you have a product and you're not doing a very good job producing it and selling it, someone else will come along and do it better, and they'll get the business. Of course, the problem with that, and the single economic lesson I want people to take away from my book, is that when you've already accrued economic power, that gives you political power. And when you have political power, you get to write the laws that then govern how people operate in the economic sphere. So it's a mutually reinforcing cycle. You get some economic success. Maybe you actually made a good product. Maybe you did something legitimate. It doesn't have to be, theft or underhanded at first, but you get that economic success that gives you some political clout because people are chasing the votes that you can buy or the jobs that you can provide or what have you. That gives you economic power again, because now you get to influence how the laws are written. Maybe the regulations are such that, you can extend the patents on the drugs that you already have. That way you don't have to waste money inventing new drugs, or, no one can compete with you because you have the market cornered on that. And that's something that we see throughout American history and world history, indeed. The railroads, for instance, obviously it's a very important service. It was very, life-changing, revolutionary in world history. But when you combine railroads with robber barons that get to dictate a lot of state government policy, they get to push the federal government towards seizing indigenous land to build more railroads, then they accrue more power, and then they get to do more things, and then they dip their toes in other industries that are related to the railroad, like steel production, for instance. Now all of a sudden you're controlling how the tracks are made and where they're placed, and how much it costs to be on the cars. All this stuff kind of accrues over time. So if you don't keep that in check or change to a system that isn't susceptible to that, you're always going to get these monopoly barons at the top, even if, in theory at least, market competition should solve those problems.
All right, let's open it up to phone calls, 866-391-1020. Our guest is Owen Symes. He was our man in Washington. A History of the Obama Years is his first book. From Zero Books, it's available in better bookstores where they still exist everywhere.
Yep, Amazon if you have to give money to Jeff Bezos, Barnes & Noble, or you can go...
I don't buy anything on Amazon.
Right. So if possible, get it from a local bookstore. The website indiebound.com tries to partner with local bookstores to source these books if it's not locally available, so I would definitely recommend that.
All right, before I take phone calls, two other quick questions. Forgive me for multi-laying this, but how did Obama serve black people that so loved him and voted for him in huge numbers, and how did he serve environmentalists who held great promise for his presidency too?
So with black people, he did them the courtesy of presenting some of these racialized issues in a federal national context that the president often does not deign to do. So especially in his second term after the Trayvon Martin murder and after the Ferguson protests began, Obama did, very beautifully often speak about these issues wherever he could. Legislatively, however, he did very little. And part of that, obviously, is the racist backlash against him, the partisanship of the Republican Party. I think part of it, too, however, was his economic team was hoping that by getting the economic system back to status quo, by helping the banks back into coherence, by pumping credit back into the system and allowing money to flow, that would, in and of itself, help everyone and hopefully then help minorities. And then as far as environmentalists go, he did some things with the green energy plan, trying to promote solar energy, for instance. His economic bill that got passed early in his presidency did have a large earmark for research into greener technologies. So these things are laudable. It's just a matter of they pushed up against other priorities that he had, helping African Americans, pushed up against keeping the banks afloat, for instance, because one of the most, predated segments of the population are minorities, with loan sharks and payday lenders and things like that. And then it kind of hurts your environmental credibility when you're fostering a boom in domestic fossil fuel production. So it's not like he did nothing, but there are some serious contradictions in his policies that I think ended up tilting his legacy more to the right.
Well, I guess any president's legacy is only determined in hindsight as the historians look at it. But you mentioned predatory lending and those kinds of things. They surely affected black people with redlining and so much more that kept us behind the eight ball economically. And we thought, I guess, that there might be some relief coming there, but not as much as we had hoped for.
Yeah, indeed. I think that's a fair thing to say.
All right. Let's go to the phones. 866-391-1020 is the number. We'll start with Steve in Duquesne. Steve, you're on KDKA.
Hi, Chris, Mr. Symes. First off, I'd just like to say a big endorsement for indiebooks.com, particularly if you don't have a local bookstore. What I'd like to present to you is two possibilities that I'd like you to comment on, Mr. Symes. When you mentioned Ron Susskind had written about the meeting that Obama had with the financial folks, which is the premise of the title of your book. At the same time, as I recall, there was a group of Republicans who would have been amenable to writing tighter legislation to regulate finance, that the too big to fail thing could have been addressed more aggressively. That's the first thing I'd like to ask. I'd like you to comment on that, whether that was a missed opportunity. More than that, one of the things that I have run into time and time again with folks that worked for Obama, there was never a dynamic in the history of the presidency where there were so many people so anxious to help. He had that over 10 million mailing list for Obama for America, that email list. It sat empty, doing nothing till at least March, whenever it was resurrected as Organizing for America, which was a very watered-down thing. When you speak about the power of lobbying, there could have been an offset to that if Obama would have simply called on his supporters to help him push legislation legislation in the direction that would have been, in my mind, more beneficial to the public.
Yeah, I think you bring up two very important points there. On the economic end of things, his economic team, although they were split, ultimately they did side on these are systemically necessary institutions, these big banks and things like that. We need them. So I don't think that his team ultimately wanted to rein that in too much. They had to kind of thread that needle between let's get rid of some of the abuses that are pretty obvious, but also we don't want to curtail them too much, which is why I often in the book refer to Obama as a neoliberal rather than a liberal in the FDR sense. He had some problems with the way capitalism had developed since the 1970s, but I think ultimately if push came to shove, he preferred markets to regulation when at all possible. So I think in that sense, he wanted his economic team to push in that direction more than the regulatory direction. So I think you're right. That is a missed opportunity there, especially when there were some Republicans of a perhaps, more classical FDR kind of bent, maybe like a, Nixon kind of Republican, because Nixon, if people don't know, Nixon was the last New Deal president, right? He's the one that created the EPA and things like that. He has an interesting legacy. As to your other question about what Obama could have done to get around lobbying, I do take him to task in the book about that because I think you're right. There were possibilities he could have investigated as far as getting around, let's say, the hospital lobby or Big Pharma when he was writing the Affordable Care Act, or his team was writing the Affordable Care Act, that he did not pursue. And there's a bunch of answers for why that might have been. Maybe he had too much faith in the system as it existed. He was too high on the election euphoria, and he thought, okay, I'm elected, I have a mandate, now I can get to work and I can reach across the aisle. And of course, that ended up being not the case, despite the fact that Obamacare is full of conservative ideas from Mitt Romney to the Heritage Foundation. The individual mandate that Republicans hated so much, that was a conservative idea from the 90s. That was a response to Clinton's attempt at healthcare reform. So I think you're right there. Obama did not pursue what could have been a grassroots groundswell approach to politics, and progressives at the time and since have really excoriated him for that. I think very justly. That's a deep failing of the way he approached politics while he was president.
Well, thank you very much. I appreciate the work on the book. Look forward to reading it.
All right. Thank you, Steve. All right. We have to take another break. 866-391-1020 is our number. We'll be right back with our final segment with Owen Symes. He was our man in Washington, the history of the Obama years. We'll be back. KDKA Radio News Time 5:50. I'm Chris Moore, the Moore of Pittsburgh. Owen Symes is our guest. He was our man in Washington, the history of the Obama years. This is his first book. It is a delightful read about history in America, and I think each and every one of you should read it because I think some of you flunked your 8th grade civics classes, to tell you the truth. And so some of this stuff needs to be you need to be reminded of. All right, our number is 866-391-1020. Let's go to the phones. The Bishop in Denora, you're on KDKA with Owen Symes.
Yes, Brother Moore. Since you was the man there in Washington, depicted in the book. Now, did you see?
Wait a minute. What? Since who was the man in Washington? What do you?
Well, I mean, that's the name of his. He was the man in Washington. I mean, ain't that the author of the book? That's
the name of the book, but do you understand that it was not you or I or other black people who named him that? It was not environmentalists who named him that. It was people in the financial sector where he said, I was the only one standing between you and the pitchforks, who came away very satisfied that he was our man in Washington. He defended the big wigs and the money grabbers, in my opinion, okay?
Okay, well, let me ask you this question. Did he foresee this deterioration of what's going on in Washington now, dealing a lot with the money? Did he come into somewhat of fruition now of the battles that are going on in Washington right now as far as the disagreement with the Democrats as far as the money is concerned?
So are you asking if I foresaw that or if Obama did while he was in office?
Well, you and did you think the President Obama did he foresee that per se?
Okay.
And do you think that he should advise the president now, Biden, and the Democratic Party to do something before they leave?
So in the conclusion of the book, I talk about how one of the uncomfortable legacies of the Obama presidency is that he tried to engage in good faith with kind of the status quo politics, reach across the aisle, make compromises with conservatives, and get a watered down but still better than nothing bill through Congress. And that worked for the first 2 years he was in office. Then the Republicans gained the majority in both houses eventually, and that broke down. And I think that was one of the most disappointing things for Obama personally, was a realization over time that his attempts at bipartisanship were kind of hopeless. And I think, like we mentioned with the last caller's question, his refusal to work outside of the normal channels ultimately hurt any kind of progressive legacy that he might have had. And I think that helped produce Trump and the current conservative party. Because when you have, and this has been going on longer than Obama, Democrats have been trying to be bipartisan for bipartisan's sake since the 70s. Republicans have been playing a different ballgame increasingly over time. But the point is, when you come into office with all this hope and change, and then you don't deliver very much, people are going to get even more upset and even more looking for answers. And sometimes I think those answers are correct. Plenty of people that supported Obama now support Bernie Sanders and AOC and other even more progressive people. But other people who voted for Obama also ended up voting for Trump because they saw Trump as an outsider and someone who would shake up the system, kind of like they thought Obama was going to shake up the system. So Obama's very limited legacy as far as actual change, I think, has helped precipitate our current crisis. And, people are more and more every day realizing how ineffective our current political institutions are. But the people in power are so beholden to these economic interests, they can't really do anything about it. Because if you try and do something, all of a sudden you're not going to get your money for re-election. And elections are so expensive now, you're kind of stuck because you're going to get primaried by someone who has a lot more money than you.
In fact, you talk about how much money Obama was able to raise among oil and gas interests, the financial industry, and others. These are the people he was beholden to.
Yeah, I think that's right. And just as an example with Biden, he got a lot of money from Border Patrol companies, the guys that, subcontract at the border to handle these facilities and provide, security and things like that. They liked him, which I think tells you something about how ethereal our partisan divide really is. Republicans and Democrats agree on a lot more than I think people sometimes realize, at least as far as the legislation they ultimately pass.
That's because all their money comes from the same places and not from individuals like you and I.
I think that's true.
All right, we got about a minute left. What would you leave us with, sir?
So I would leave us with economic power and political power are tied together. You can't have a functioning democracy when corporations rule the roost. So whether that means unions, whether it means worker co-ops, or however, if your workplace is run like a dictatorship and your boss controls all the decisions, that's not how you get political liberty, let alone economic liberty. And I would also like to reinforce the idea that the Republicans and the Democrats are two sides of the same coin because they all get their funding from the same sources ultimately. So we're not going to get real legitimate change if all we're doing is voting. Voting is important, especially in local elections, but we have to try and reform our economic system before we can get real progress.
Is that possible?
I think, what's that saying? Anything is impossible until it's done. They would like us to think it's impossible, but every status quo changes. No one's in power forever.
All right. I want to thank you, Owen Symes. He was our man in Washington. It's available on Amazon.com. History of the Obama years at independent bookstores everywhere, published by Zero Books. Owen Symes, thank you for a very intelligent hour. We appreciate your time, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Chris.